Lucas Miller, a 16-year-old boy from a neglected town, shares a small, run-down apartment with his younger sister, Emma, and their father, Robert, who works long hours at a local factory to make ends meet. The walls of their home are thin, the floors creak with every step, and the sound of traffic and shouting from the streets below seeps in at all hours. Since the death of his mother 3 years ago, Lucas has shouldered responsibilities far beyond his age. He cooks, cleans, and cares for Emma, who looks up to him as both a brother and a source of comfort in their harsh world. Despite his tender age, Lucas often feels the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders, a heavy reminder of how fragile their existence has become. Yet, even in the face of relentless struggles, Lucas holds onto his dreams with fierce determination. His heart yearns for a life where Emma can grow up without fear of eviction notices or empty cupboards, and where Robert no longer has to exhaust himself just to scrape by. However, these aspirations seem distant, almost unreachable, as the grip of poverty surrounds them like a cage. Lucas often finds himself staring out of their cracked window at the city skyline, wondering if people born into privilege realize how lucky they are. He doesn't resent them, but he aches to one day break free from the suffocating cycle of hardship and give his family a glimpse of a better tomorrow. As Lucas trudged home from his part-time job at the diner, the evening air carried a chill that mirrored his exhaustion. His uniform smelled faintly of grease, and his feet ached from hours of standing. Turning onto a quieter street, he noticed an elderly man struggling with several paper bags filled to the brim with groceries. The man's hands shook as he tried to steady the load, and one bag threatened to topple over. Without a second thought, Lucas hurried to his side, catching the bag before it spilled. "Thank you, son," the man said, his voice warm but strained. Lucas offered to help carry the groceries the rest of the way, and together they walked slowly to the man's modest home a few blocks away. Along the way, the man introduced himself as Mr. Harrison, a retired music teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. When they reached Mr. Harrison's door, he invited Lucas inside for a moment of rest. The cozy but cluttered home was filled with books, sheet music, and instruments, some carefully displayed while others lay forgotten under a thin layer of dust. Spotting Lucas's curious gaze, Mr. Harrison walked over to a corner where an old violin sat on a weathered stand. "That one hasn't been played in years," he said with a wistful smile. As a token of gratitude, Mr. Harrison insisted Lucas take it, despite the boy's protests. The violin was worn, its strings slightly loose, but Lucas felt an inexplicable connection as he held it in his hands. He had no experience with music, but something about the gesture, the history of the instrument, and the trust in Mr. Harrison's eyes planted a seed of curiosity and hope. It was as if this simple act of kindness had awakened a spark he didn't know he had. Late at night, when the apartment was finally quiet, Lucas sat on the edge of his bed with the old violin resting in his lap. The dim light of a single bulb flickered softly, casting shadows on the peeling wallpaper. He held the bow awkwardly, his fingers trembling slightly as he drew it across the strings for the first time. The sound that emerged was raw and uneven, a far cry from anything resembling music, but there was something deeply satisfying about the vibrations that filled the air. Each note, no matter how imperfect, seemed to unlock a part of himself he hadn't realized was hidden. He experimented hesitantly, trying different movements, allowing his instincts to guide him. The more he played, the more the outside world, the poverty, the struggles, the uncertainty, faded into the background, leaving only him and the voice of the instrument. Emma, who often struggled to fall asleep, tiptoed to the doorway and watched her brother. She didn't interrupt, fascinated by the way his usual weariness seemed to lift with each note. Eventually, she spoke softly, "Lucas, that sounds Really nice. Startled, he turned, expecting her to tease him. But her expression was earnest and filled with admiration. Embarrassed but encouraged, he smiled and promised to improve. Emma sat beside him, listening intently as he continued, her small presence giving him a quiet kind of courage. That night became the first of many where Lucas and the violin became inseparable, with Emma as his first and most loyal audience. Though he was far from mastering the instrument, the sense of possibility it brought ignited a fire in him that nothing else ever had. It wasn't just a violin. It was a lifeline to something greater, a whisper of dreams that no longer felt so impossible. At school, Lucas's days were filled with a constant undercurrent of ridicule. His classmates, quick to notice his worn-out sneakers and patched-up backpack, whispered behind his back or, worse, made their jabs loud enough for him to hear. "Hey, Mozart," one of them sneered one morning after spotting the violin case Lucas had brought to school. "Going to play us a sad song about how broke you are?" The laughter that followed stung more than Lucas cared to admit, and he kept his eyes fixed on the floor, gripping the handle of the case tightly. Despite his efforts to rise above the taunts, each comment chipped away at his confidence. Every cruel word felt like a reminder of the gap between his dreams and the reality of his life, a gap that seemed to widen with every passing day. During lunch, Lucas sat with Jake, his childhood friend, hoping for some support. Instead, Jake sighed and gave him a look of pity. "Look, man," Jake started, his voice low, "I get it. You're into this violin thing, but it's not going to pay the bills. You've got to be practical. Get a job that actually matters, something stable, you know? Music's just a hobby, not a way out." Lucas tried to argue, but Jake's words lingered long after their conversation ended. For the first time, doubt began to take root. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe his dreams were nothing more than illusions, distractions from the hard truth of their circumstances. That evening, Lucas sat with the violin in his lap, unable to play. The joy and hope the instrument once brought him now felt clouded by a heavy sense of inadequacy. One crisp afternoon, Lucas found a quiet spot in the park under an old oak tree, his violin case resting at his feet. He had taken to practicing there, away from the mocking voices of his classmates and the prying eyes of neighbors. As he closed his eyes and played, the notes were unpolished but full of emotion, echoing his hopes and frustrations. Unbeknownst to him, a young woman sitting on a nearby bench had been listening intently. Sophie Turner, a student at the prestigious Eastwood Conservatory of Music, was captivated by the raw energy in Lucas's playing. Though his technique was unrefined, there was a rare depth to his sound, something she had never encountered in the polished halls of her school. When he finally stopped, she approached with a warm smile, her violin slung over her shoulder. "You've got something special," she said, startling Lucas. Embarrassed, he muttered a shy thanks, unsure how to react. Sophie introduced herself and asked if he had a teacher. When he admitted he was self-taught, she offered to show him some basic techniques. "Just a few tips," she said kindly, noticing his hesitation. But Lucas, feeling acutely aware of his lack of formal training and intimidated by her polished demeanor, shook his head. "I wouldn't want to waste your time," he mumbled, looking away. Sophie frowned slightly, sensing his unease. "You're not wasting anyone's time," she said firmly, "but it's your call. Just know you have something worth developing." She handed him a small card with her number before walking away, leaving Lucas conflicted. As he stared at the card, he felt a strange mixture of pride and self-doubt, unsure whether to take the leap she had offered or retreat back into his familiar solitude. A few days after their encounter, Sophie found herself unable to forget Lucas's raw, heartfelt playing. There was something so authentic about his music, a kind of emotional purity that she rarely heard, even among the most trained musicians at her school. Without telling Lucas, she brought her phone to the park and discreetly recorded a short video of him practicing. The footage wasn't perfect. Birds chirped in the background, and the occasional hum of a passing car intruded, but his passion shone through every note. Later that evening, she showed the recording to her mentor, Ms. Carter, a respected music teacher at Eastwood Conservatory. Watching the video, Ms. Carter's face lit up with interest. "This boy has something special," she said. "He's untrained, but that's part of what makes his sound so unique. He plays from the heart." Ms. Carter immediately suggested inviting Lucas to perform at an upcoming community music event. Sophie hesitated, knowing how shy Lucas could be, but she decided to take the chance. The next day, she approached Lucas in the park and told him about the opportunity. At first, Lucas was stunned and overwhelmed with anxiety. The idea of performing in front of an audience seemed far beyond his reach. "I'm not good enough for something like that," he protested, clutching his violin protectively. But Sophie's encouragement, paired with Ms. Carter's confidence in his potential, planted a seed of hope. After much deliberation, Lucas agreed, though his nerves gnawed at him. Deep down, he realized this could be more than just a performance. It could be the start of a journey toward proving that his music and his dreams were worth pursuing. The day of the community event arrived, and Lucas stood backstage, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The crowd beyond the curtain seemed impossibly large, their chatter blending into a hum that made his nerves spike. As his name was announced, Lucas felt his hands tremble around the neck of his violin. Doubts swirled in his mind. What if he wasn't good enough? What if the audience laughed at him? Taking a deep breath, he stepped onto the stage, the bright lights blinding him momentarily. He focused on the instrument in his hands, remembering Emma's encouragement and the sacrifices his family had made. With a shaky bow, he began to play. The first notes wavered, but as he closed his eyes and let his emotions guide him, the music grew steady and powerful. The audience fell silent, captivated by the raw intensity of his performance. When Lucas finished, the room erupted into applause, a sound he had never expected to hear for himself. Standing on stage, he felt a surge of pride like never before. He had done it. He had shared his heart through his music and been met with acceptance. Among the clapping crowd, a discerning pair of eyes belonging to Mr. Bennett, a talent scout, studied Lucas intently. After the performance, Mr. Bennett approached him with a mixture of enthusiasm and critique. "You have incredible potential," he said, his voice steady but kind. "But raw talent alone won't take you far. You need structure, training, someone to guide you." The words struck Lucas deeply. While he was elated by the recognition, he realized that his journey was just beginning. There was so much more to learn, and this performance was only the first step in proving to himself and the world that his music was more than just a dream. It was his destiny. After the event, Mr. Bennett pulled Lucas aside and spoke with a calm yet persuasive tone. "You've got something extraordinary, Lucas," he began, "but to develop it, you need proper guidance. I'm prepared to offer you a scholarship for private music lessons with some of the best instructors I know." The words felt surreal, as if Lucas had stepped into someone else's life. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to focus entirely on music, to learn, to grow, to chase his dreams without hesitation. But as Mr. Bennett explained the commitment required, reality came crashing back. The lessons would demand his full dedication, leaving little time for his part-time job at the diner. Without that income, how would his family manage? The weight of his responsibilities settled heavily on his shoulders. That evening, Lucas sat at the tiny kitchen table in their cramped apartment, the scholarship offer weighing on his mind. Across from him, his father, Robert, nursed a cup of coffee after another grueling day at the factory. Lucas hesitated before bringing up the offer, unsure of how his father would react. "It's an amazing opportunity," he said quietly, "but I don't know if I can leave the diner." Robert looked at him with tired but understanding eyes. "Lucas, I know you've been doing everything you can for this family," he said, "but maybe this is your chance to do something for yourself, for your future. We'll figure out the rest." Even with his father's encouragement, Lucas remained torn. The thought of abandoning his responsibilities filled him with guilt, but so did the idea of letting his dreams slip away. As he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, Lucas realized that whichever path he chose would come with sacrifices, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to make them. Robert watched his son wrestle with the decision, the conflict evident in Lucas's furrowed brow and hesitant tone. He could see how much the opportunity meant to Lucas, but he also knew how deeply his son felt the burden of their financial struggles. One evening, as they sat together in the dimly lit living room, Robert made his decision. "Lucas," he said firmly, "you've done so much to keep this family afloat. It's time I step up so you can chase this dream." Lucas looked at his father in surprise as Robert explained his plan to take on extra shifts at the factory. "It won't be easy," Robert admitted, "but I'll manage. You don't need to worry about us. You need to focus on this chance. It might not come around again." The words filled Lucas with both gratitude and determination. He felt a lump in his throat as he nodded, his father's sacrifice weighing heavily on his heart. The next morning, Lucas approached Mr. Bennett to accept the scholarship. From that day on, he threw himself into his lessons with an unrelenting drive, practicing late into the night and soaking up every piece of advice his instructors offered. With each passing day, Lucas grew more skilled, but he never lost sight of why he was doing it. Every time he picked up his violin, he thought of Robert's tired hands, Emma's hopeful eyes, and the sacrifices his family had made. "I won't let them down," he promised himself. The scholarship wasn't just an opportunity for Lucas. It was a lifeline for his entire family, and he vowed to turn it into something that would make them proud. From the moment Lucas walked into his first music class, the differences between him and the other students were glaringly obvious. Most of them arrived in crisp clothes, carrying brand new instruments, and speaking in confident tones about their private tutors and years of experience. Among them was Oliver Grant, a tall, polished student with a violin that gleamed as brightly as his arrogance. Lucas noticed Oliver's dismissive glance the moment their eyes met. A silent judgment passed on his second-hand instrument and thrift store clothes. During introductions, when Lucas admitted he was self-taught, Oliver smirked and whispered to the classmate beside him, loud enough for Lucas to hear, "Self-taught? He's in the wrong place. This isn't amateur hour." The comment stung, but Lucas kept his head high, determined not to let Oliver's words get to him. As the weeks went on, Oliver's disdain grew more overt. In every practice session or class discussion, he found ways to belittle Lucas's progress. "Maybe stick to playing in parks," he sneered after one rehearsal. "That's more your level." Lucas could feel his frustration boiling, but instead of letting it break him, he channeled that anger into his practice. Every snide remark and condescending laugh only fueled his resolve to prove Oliver wrong. He spent hours refining his technique, pushing past his limits, and listening intently to his instructor's feedback. While Oliver thrived on his polished skills and connections, Lucas leaned into his raw determination and the unshakable belief that his passion was just as valuable as anyone's privilege. Though their rivalry was born from conflict, it became the fire that pushed Lucas to fight harder for his place and prove that talent and perseverance could stand tall against arrogance. The days blurred into one another as Lucas juggled his relentless schedule. Mornings began early with school, where his mind often wandered during classes, weighed down by the thoughts of unfinished assignments and upcoming music pieces he had yet to perfect. Afternoons were spent in lessons or practice rooms, where his instructors pushed him harder with each session. Evenings were reserved for more practice at home, squeezed in between helping Emma with her homework and checking on his father, who often came home late and exhausted from his extra shifts at the factory. By the time Lucas crawled into bed, it was well past midnight, his fingers sore from hours of playing and his head heavy with exhaustion. The violin, once a source of solace and hope, began to feel like a burden he couldn't escape. As the weeks passed, the cracks in Lucas's resolve began to show. Mistakes during rehearsals became more frequent, and his instructor's feedback, though constructive, started to feel like harsh criticism to his frayed nerves. He began questioning himself during every practice session. Was he good enough? Did he even belong in this world of polished musicians who seemed so far ahead of him? At school, he struggled to keep up with his classes, and his grades slipped, adding another layer of stress. Late one night, sitting in the dimly lit apartment with his violin in his lap, Lucas stared at the instrument and wondered if he was chasing an impossible dream. He thought about the sacrifices his family had made and felt the weight of their hopes resting on him. The pressure was overwhelming, and for the first time since he started, Lucas wondered if the dream was worth the cost. The call came late in the afternoon, cutting through the hum of Lucas's violin practice like a knife. His father's supervisor informed him that Robert had suffered an accident at the factory. One of the machines had malfunctioned, and Robert had been caught in the chaos. Though the injuries weren't life-threatening, they were severe enough to keep him out of work for weeks, possibly months. Lucas's heart sank as he hung up the phone. He rushed to the hospital, where he found his father lying in a hospital bed, his hand heavily bandaged and his face pale. Robert tried to reassure him, downplaying the situation, but Lucas could see the worry in his father's eyes. The factory job had been their lifeline, and without it, the fragile balance they had managed to maintain was at risk of crumbling. That night, as Lucas sat in their small kitchen, staring at the bills piled on the table, a sense of dread settled over him. The thought of his family slipping further into financial trouble made his stomach churn. He looked at his violin, propped against the wall, and felt a pang of guilt. How could he justify spending hours practicing when his family needed him to step up and fill the gap left by his father's injury? The idea of abandoning his music lessons loomed large in his mind. Perhaps it was time to let go of his dreams and focus on something practical, something that could provide immediate help to his family. The thought felt like a betrayal to everything he had worked for, but the burden of responsibility pressed heavily on him. As the hours ticked by, Lucas was left grappling with the impossible choice between his passion and his family's survival. When Sophie learned about Lucas's father's accident, she immediately told Ms. Carter. The two wasted no time devising a plan to help Lucas and his family. Sophie suggested organizing a fundraiser, combining a community concert with a donation drive. Ms. Carter agreed, using her connections to gather local musicians, students, and volunteers to participate. Posters were quickly printed and distributed around the neighborhood, advertising the event as a night of music for a golden heart. Sophie worked tirelessly, reaching out to friends and family, while Ms. Carter called on her network to spread the word. The outpouring of support was incredible, with people offering their time, resources, and even small monetary contributions. On the night of the event, Lucas was invited as a special guest but had no idea of the true purpose behind the concert. When he arrived, he was stunned to see the packed community hall and the banners promoting support for his family. As he watched musicians perform, including Sophie, he felt a lump form in his throat. After the final performance, Ms. Carter addressed the audience. explaining Lucas's situation and the fundraiser's goal. The room erupted into applause as people approached to donate and offer words of encouragement. Lucas, overwhelmed by the kindness and solidarity, realized for the first time that he wasn't alone in his struggles. The burden that had felt so isolating now seemed lighter, carried by a community that believed in him and his family. The gesture reignited his determination to keep moving forward, not just for himself but for the people who believed in him. One afternoon, Mr. Bennett called Lucas into his office with an air of excitement. "Lucas," he began, "there's an audition coming up for the National Youth Orchestra. It's one of the most prestigious programs in the country, and I believe you have what it takes to make an impression." Lucas's breath caught in his throat as the words sank in. The chance to audition for such an elite group felt surreal, but the weight of the opportunity was immediately followed by a wave of anxiety. What if he wasn't ready? What if he failed? The thought of being judged by a panel of experts, his every note scrutinized, made his palms sweat. He hesitated, unsure if he could live up to the expectations Mr. Bennett had for him. "I don't know if I'm good enough," he admitted quietly, his voice tinged with self-doubt. That evening, Lucas confided in Sophie about the audition, hoping for advice but expecting little reassurance. To his surprise, Sophie's response was firm and unwavering. "You have to go for it, Lucas," she said, her eyes lighting up with determination. "Opportunities like this don't come around every day. Even if it's terrifying, you owe it to yourself to try." She reminded him of how far he'd come, from practicing in a park with no formal training to performing on stage and earning the respect of skilled musicians. Sophie even offered to help him prepare, suggesting extra practice sessions and offering tips to boost his confidence. Her belief in him rekindled a small spark of hope. Though the fear of failure still lingered, Lucas found himself agreeing to take the leap, promising to give the audition everything he had. As Lucas stood under the harsh stage lights, the grand auditorium seemed to stretch endlessly before him. The faint rustle of judges flipping through their notes only heightened the oppressive silence, amplifying the pounding of his heart. His hands trembled as he adjusted the violin under his chin, his mind racing with self-doubt. What if he hit a wrong note? What if his performance wasn't enough? For a moment, he froze, the weight of the judge's eyes and the magnitude of the opportunity paralyzing him. His bow hovered above the strings, and the seconds dragged on, each one more unbearable than the last. A soft cough from the panel jolted him, reminding him he was running out of time to start. The faces of his classmates, Oliver's sneers, and the whispers of his own fears filled his mind. Then, through the noise in his head, Lucas thought of his family. He saw his father's weary smile, Emma's hopeful gaze, and Sophie's unwavering belief in him. He remembered the countless nights spent practicing in the dim light of their apartment, the sacrifices his father made to keep him in lessons, and the community that had rallied behind him. Closing his eyes, he took a deep, steadying breath and let those memories guide him. He began to play, the bow moving smoothly across the strings. The first notes wavered slightly, but soon, the music flowed with an intensity and depth that silenced the room. He poured everything he had into the performance. His struggles, his dreams, his gratitude, and his love for those who had supported him. By the time the last note lingered in the air, Lucas opened his eyes to see the panel sitting in stunned silence, their pens resting motionless on their papers. For the first time, Lucas felt like he had truly been heard. When the results were announced, Lucas's heart sank as his name wasn't called for the top spot. Sitting quietly in the audience, he struggled to mask his disappointment, his hands clenched tightly around his violin case. The applause for the chosen candidate felt distant and hollow, a reminder that he had come so close but hadn't made it. As the crowd began to disperse, Lucas remained in his seat, staring blankly at the stage where he had poured out his heart just hours ago. Doubts swirled in his mind, louder and heavier than before. Had he not worked hard enough? Was his talent simply not enough to compete at this level? The weight of it all, his family's sacrifices, the community's support, and his own dreams, pressed on his chest, leaving him feeling as though he had failed everyone, including himself. Miss Carter found him sitting there, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her voice calm but firm. "Lucas," she began, "this isn't the end. You played with a depth and honesty that can't be taught, and that's worth more than any prize." He looked up at her, the sting of rejection still fresh in his eyes. Sensing his pain, she continued, "Every great musician faces setbacks. It's part of the journey. Growth comes from moments like these, not just from victories." Her words carried a wisdom that slowly began to pierce through Lucas's doubt. Though the disappointment lingered, he realized she was right. This wasn't a failure. It was a stepping stone. Lucas resolved to take the experience as a lesson, a reminder that his journey wasn't about a single competition, but about the passion and perseverance that had brought him this far. A month had passed since the audition, and Lucas had begun to settle back into his routine. The sting of not earning the top spot had dulled, but it still lingered in the quiet moments when he was alone with his violin. He focused on his practice, trying to channel his disappointment into improvement, though a small part of him wondered if the audition had been his only chance. One afternoon, as he sat by the window, lost in thought, his phone buzzed on the table. Hesitantly, he picked it up and answered. The voice on the other end introduced themselves as the director of the National Youth Orchestra. Lucas's breath caught as the director explained that while he hadn't secured a primary position, they were impressed by his passion and had decided to offer him a spot as a substitute. The offer wasn't what Lucas had initially dreamed of, but as the words sank in, he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. This was still an opportunity, a chance to play alongside some of the best young musicians in the country and to prove himself in a professional setting. He accepted the position with a mix of humility and determination, thanking the director profusely for believing in him. After the call ended, Lucas sat quietly for a moment, a smile spreading across his face. It wasn't the leading role he had envisioned, but it was a start, a foothold on the path he had been striving toward. For Lucas, this wasn't just a job. It was a validation of his journey and a reminder that even small steps forward could lead to something extraordinary. Joining the orchestra as a substitute, Lucas initially felt like a small fish in a vast ocean. Surrounded by highly skilled and experienced musicians, he quietly took his place, observing and learning from every rehearsal. Though he started with smaller parts, his passion and distinctive style quickly began to shine. Unlike many who played with precision alone, Lucas's performances carried an emotional depth that was impossible to ignore. Whether it was a quiet passage or a climactic solo, he infused his playing with raw honesty, drawing audiences into his world. Fellow musicians, initially indifferent to the newcomer, began to take notice. Some approached him after rehearsals, complimenting his artistry and even seeking his advice on interpretation. Slowly but steadily, Lucas began to feel like he belonged. As Lucas's reputation grew, so did the opportunities around him. Invitations to perform in small ensembles and solo pieces started to trickle in. At one concert, a prominent composer in the audience was so moved by Lucas's performance that he approached him afterward with an offer to collaborate on a new piece. For Lucas, these moments were both exhilarating and humbling. Each new door that opened was a testament to the years of effort, sacrifice, and belief that had brought him to this point. While he still carried a sense of responsibility toward his family, Lucas began to see a future where his passion for music could also provide for those he loved. Step by step, his once distant dreams started to feel tangible, and the world that had once seemed out of reach was now opening its arms to him. The invitation to perform a solo at a high-profile charity concert came as a surprise to Lucas. The event was set to feature renowned musicians and influential patrons from across the country. When he received the news, a familiar pang of doubt crept in, reminding him of the nerves that had gripped him during his audition months earlier. But this time, Lucas was determined not to let fear dictate his actions. He threw himself into preparation, practicing tirelessly and seeking advice from his mentors. Sophie and Ms. Carter stood by his side, encouraging him at every step, reminding him of how far he had come. On the night of the concert, Lucas took the stage in front of the largest audience he had ever faced. The dazzling lights and murmuring crowd could have been overwhelming, but instead of succumbing to the pressure, Lucas drew strength from the journey that had brought him here. As he began to play, the hall fell silent. The first notes of his violin soared through the air, filled with passion and clarity. Each stroke of the bow told a story of struggle, perseverance, and triumph. Lucas lost himself in the music, his heart guiding his performance. By the time he played the final note, the audience erupted into a thunderous standing ovation. Tears welled in his eyes as he bowed, overwhelmed by the response. After the concert, a representative from a prestigious conservatory approached him, extending an offer for a full scholarship to their program. The moment felt surreal, a culmination of years of sacrifice and determination. For Lucas, this wasn't just an achievement. It was a gateway to the future he had dreamed of, a chance to hone his craft at the highest level while honoring the people who had supported him along the way. Years later, Lucas stood on the grand stage of a world-famous concert hall, the applause of a captivated audience ringing in his ears. His name had become synonymous with artistry and passion, celebrated in music circles across the globe. Critics praised his unique ability to infuse every performance with profound emotion, a quality rooted in the struggles and triumphs of his journey. Despite the accolades and fame, Lucas never forgot where he came from. The memory of his family's tiny apartment, the sacrifices his father made, and the encouragement of people like Sophie and Ms. Carter remained deeply ingrained in his heart. These experiences fueled his desire to ensure that others like him, children with talent but limited means, would have a chance to chase their dreams. Determined to make a difference, Lucas used his platform to establish the Golden Strings Foundation, a program dedicated to providing instruments, lessons, and mentorship to underprivileged kids. The foundation became a lifeline for many, opening doors for children who might never have discovered their potential otherwise. Lucas personally visited schools and community centers, sharing his story and performing for aspiring young musicians. Each interaction reminded him of the boy he once was, holding a second-hand violin and dreaming of a better future. His journey from poverty to international success became an inspiration for countless people, a testament to the power of resilience and kindness. Lucas's life wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a shining example that even in the face of adversity, a golden heart could light the way forward for many.